Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the Fintech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. I'm really excited for today's conversation with Sami Start, who is the co-founder and CEO at Transak. We're going to talk about fintech, about DeFi, about the on-ramps into the crypto ecosystem. And Transak is one of the most interesting and successful companies building out on-ramps and developer tools to bridge these payments gaps. So with that, Sami, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Lex, good to be here.
So let's start with what pulled you towards some of these themes, like what got you interested in software, in technology. Before you went on to found a company, what drove you into these directions?
I've always been very much into computers. And I think the first time I wrote proper code was in my physics undergraduate degree. So it was writing some C++ code to simulate physics experiments. After that, I kind of got more and more interested in the space. And I also saw that a lot of the most fast-growing companies in the world were using tech and that it was kind of eating the world, in order to use the words of A16Z, right? So I was very much interested in that. I did a master's in computer science and I learned how to write, somewhat proper code. And from there, I worked in high-frequency trading. So I was writing code to automate the market making of the options on the S&P 500, and found that very fascinating. And I definitely have a lot of trading DNA in my system. Eventually decided to go more into B2C fintech. And I joined a company called Smarkets that was doing prediction markets, centralized prediction markets, that is, not decentralized. There, I really got exposed to a very typical B2C fintech company. And I saw a lot about how to onboard users, because we had orchestrated a bunch of different KYC providers, payment methods in order to onboard users. I also got very exposed to developer tooling, because my team at Smarkets was building out the outward-facing APIs. So we kind of built that system from scratch and onboarded the first external developers to trade on the exchange. That's really how I got my basis in technology.
It's interesting because you've got these two experiences. One is very institutional, right? Like a market maker for options and equities, like definitely sort of a behind the scenes kind of company, infrastructure company almost, maybe like taking advantage of market structure in order to generate profit. And then the other company is much more in the consumer and then distribution game of developers and people. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your impressions of the cultures of these two different places and your impressions of the approaches these types of companies took to what they were doing?
I'll start with things they have in common. So I was very lucky to be working in both companies where everyone was very smart and intellectually curious and just enjoyed solving difficult problems. Both of the companies that I worked at were very, very heavy on engineering and very light on kind of non-technical roles. So I was surrounded by very, very technical people who enjoyed solving difficult problems. And that's probably the main reason why I also got into it as well. I just enjoy solving difficult problems. My brain needs to be on something difficult in order to feel kind of fulfilled by my day-to-day. What they had differently in both companies is that market making has some kind of outward-facing mission. So the mission of the company was to, quote, make the markets more efficient, which is definitely true. If market makers didn't exist, then the markets would be pretty messy and you wouldn't be able to execute prices very well, which is super important function. But in B2C fintech, you really feel the effects of what you do, and you can kind of tangibly see how users are using your product. That's what drew me into that space, because you can make a lot of money in market making, right? And trading. But I didn't want to do that as a pure endeavor. I didn't want to do trading as a pure endeavor. So I kind of wanted to do something that would that would impact people and impact the world. That's why more like B2C fintech and dev tooling kind of appeals to me. It's something that I can talk about and feel like it's kind of aligned with what I want to do in the world. I got into software engineering as a means to solving problems. Some people do software engineering just because they like writing code and they like doing that. But for me, it was more a means to an end. I didn't necessarily want to be sitting writing code all the time. I just kind of wanted to solve interesting problems. And I just saw that as a language, as a toolkit to do that, in the same way that, Excel is a tool, in the same way that Photoshop is a tool. I just saw code as another tool.
I'm going to go a little bit abstract here because I'm curious to your answer, especially given your mathematical, physics, and computer science background. Define for us what exactly is a problem in the sense that you are talking about, right? Like you're referencing Andreessen, and we're talking about using code to break down or solve or, maybe optimize some sort of problem. In the abstract sense, what does it mean for you to identify a problem? What is the shape of it to you? And maybe we just start there.
A problem, when you start with it, it's typically a very loosely defined statement. Like let's say I want to help people to optimize their time or something like that, right? That's a very, very loosely defined thought that you would have in the shower, right? Like I want to help people. And I'm just kind of making this up as I go along here because I'm not allowed to talk about Transak. But I want to help people to optimize their time. And so you would say, okay, what kind of people do I want to help to optimize their time? And what are the biggest problems that I want to solve in helping them to optimize their time? You might end up with a very kind of specific niche, right? Like you might end up with kind of, I want to help people who have, hearing problems to like get the most out of their work environment. Or I want to help people who have in the older age bracket to like make the most out of their personal life or something like that. So you kind of have to narrow down the problem. That's something I quite enjoy. And then you have to define it very, very clearly. You have to break down the problem. Let's take, for example, like self-driving cars. So if you want to build a self-driving car, there's a whole bunch of subsystems there that you have to solve for, right? So how do you sense objects around you? That's a whole problem that you have to solve. How do you input that information into a central system that kind of monitors the direction of the car? And then how do you actually take signals from that system in order to change the car and steer it and all those kind of things? And then there's hardware problems. So I really enjoy taking a really, really big problem and kind of breaking it down into sub-problems and then solving those sub-problems. That's probably something that comes from physics as well, because in physics, we had to do that a lot, right? You had to take very, very big problems and like break them down into like sub-equations and kind of solve them.
Yeah, I think there's an element of observing the environment to see where something, maybe something's not clearing, right? Or maybe where the equilibrium for some particular thing is financially fine, but then from a human happiness perspective is quite bad because there's maybe a bad distribution of resources or some other symptom of a problem. I'm curious, in this kind of still abstract space that we're in, do you feel that there are single point solutions to these things, like that there's one answer, or is there a series of different answers that are equally worthwhile? And how does one navigate that mental space?
Super interesting question. I think that it depends on how clearly defined the problem is and how simple the problem is. So if you take a very, very simple problem, then it tends to converge on like, one or two very simple solutions. But if you take a very, very big, poorly defined problem, such as like ending world hunger or curing cancer or something like that, then there's so many things that go into each of those things, right? And you can spend your whole life trying to solve those problems, and you'll never run out of stuff to do, which for me, I like to kind of solve the very big problems because that kind of gives you more to be getting on with in your life. I think those are also some of the undervalued problems in the world. I think that people tend to perhaps gravitate towards more simple solutions that can be solved in like just a few years or just a few months. But the really, really big problems just have so much scope to expand out and to solve in new ways.
The time horizon dimension is interesting too. And this gets to, like this idea of like, how quickly can you process towards a solution? I'm getting a bit silly here, but you can't simulate the world and process it faster than the world processes information on its own, and so like you can't solve something that's insolvable in a sense. You can't go faster than the natural system. And so some of these things, especially these complex systems like how do we bring artificial intelligence into self-driving cars, influenced by things like the hardware, the supply of mathematicians, the venture capital, and so on, the amount of science fiction writing. Like these things, you can't push them forward from just one dimension and hope for an answer. And so all that, I want to get to then the problem that you did end up picking and that you did end up thinking was kind of sufficiently large, and that is at the root of Transak. So let's talk about what that is.
Something I'll just add to what you said is also defining the problem is actually the most difficult part, because you start with something quite abstract and actually defining it. It's hard to do meaningful work on the problem until you've very clearly defined it. Even yourself to do the meaningful work, but to get other people to collaborate with you is you have to define the problem very clearly. So the way the problem started out for me was making financial applications accessible, full stop, right? So making financial applications accessible. And before I started working on what is now Transak, I was actually just working on normal financial onboarding. I was looking at open banking. I was looking at unified developer toolkit to onboard users from around the world. And then I kind of went at that from a few different angles. And again, this is kind of defining the problem, right? I hadn't really figured out exactly how to define the problem clearly. And then around 2016, 2017, I also, invested in ETH, and I wrote my first smart contract and deployed it. I was kind of sold on the new internet and Web3 and all this kind of stuff. And so it was in February 2019, I coupled those two concepts together of making financial applications accessible and also Web3, right? And I saw that Web3 was kind of that coordination point that would help to create this developer onboarding toolkit. And then eventually I met my co-founder and I met a other bunch of very smart people to collaborate on. And then the problem kind of evolved into making Web3 applications accessible from a developer point of view, right? So the problem that we're trying to solve is how do we make Web3 applications that involve money, right? So still kind of financial applications accessible through the developer's point of view. The distinction there is that we're dealing with Web3 applications that involve money, which is the scope of that has kind of broadened now because now games involve money, DAOs involve money, and other things involve money. So yeah, Web3 applications that involve money, we're trying to empower developers to make it more accessible to mainstream users.
Who are these developers? What profile are you talking about when you frame this idea? And maybe more broadly, even a lot of the discussion these days of embedded finance and the core driver of the Web3 economy goes to trying to figure out who the developers are and who the builders are. How do you think about it?
The developers is the very first people who I was speaking to when I first started working on this problem. That was dApps, right? I mean, most of the use cases since 2019 and still today are around DeFi, CeFi, TradFi, and games. And there are definitely a lot of flavors of those things. And you can say NFTs and those kind of things. But I really see NFTs as more of a solution than like a kind of problem area. So it's mostly DeFi apps. So apps such as Compound or, when I started out, it was like Compound and MakerDAO, right? Obviously, there's a lot more now. And then games such as Decentraland, Axie, these kind of things. And I also see these kind of worlds converging as well. I see all of these kind of things converging into more of a ecosystem rather than being very separate categories as well. So those are the main kind of areas that I'm seeing. We also work with wallets and exchanges. But again, I see wallets and exchanges as kind of more of a solution space than a problem space. So that kind of people who we work with in order to collaborate and solve the onboarding problem. But it's not the end in itself. It's kind of the part of the solution, I would say.
And if we just meditate on like a Maker or an Axie, which is an interesting counterexample, what do they get from Transak? Like, what is their experience with what they're integrating in or turning on? And then once we understand, like how they quote unquote plug in, I want to talk about the nuts and bolts underneath of what is actually going on. But just if we start at the level of a developer needs to plug in X, and this is how they do it with your product.
Let's take the example of Decentraland, which is one of Transak's partners. And if you want to use Decentraland, I mean, it's still very much evolving, but if you want to use Decentraland, you need to have a wallet with some crypto in it. You don't need to, but in order to use kind of a lot of the features, you need to have that. And so the problem I think is probably quite well known for most people is like, I have users landing on my app. They need to onboard into crypto. So I don't want to send them to a third-party exchange and make them buy a bunch of crypto and then come back because it's not an integrated user experience. So I want to onboard them within the application itself. And even if they own crypto already, they may not own the right crypto, right? So they may not own crypto on the right chain of the right token. We want to create a very smooth and integrated onboarding experience that can allow them to buy the crypto. Along with that problem, there are also a bunch of very interesting adjacent problems, right? So if you don't have crypto yet, you probably also don't have a wallet. And if you don't have those things, then you probably also don't have the necessary tokens to pay gas fees or know how to pay gas fees and execute a transaction. And then there may also be some identity pieces involved in that as well, such as you may need to verify that you're a real person in order to do a metaverse dating event. It's a very niche example, but it's a real example. And so Transak we're not necessarily trying to build all of those tools ourselves from the ground up, but we're definitely trying to partner with the right people and to orchestrate everything and make it so that app developers can onboard their users. And it looks like a very kind of mainstream experience that anyone can do.
I love the example of the metaverse dating event needing like KYC. Otherwise,
not full KYC, by the way. This is kind of a subtle point, but it's just an attestation about a part of the user's identity. We're not saying that you need to like fully KYC in order to do these things, which is a very nuanced part of identity that is kind of coming in decentralized applications.
I think identity is getting more and more unbundled from the idea of you're going to have a passport or a flag to wave around and becoming much more anchored to what people actually do and not an abstraction of what they do, but their actual history, which can be compressed real time into some aspect of them that they want to represent. If I were to try to make an analogy, right, if you look at earlier versions of the internet, you couldn't have e-commerce, for example, without payment processing that was modern for that experience, without a cart in which to check out and without a payment method to which that cart is attached and without, some sort of back-end experience for the retailer that is managing this checkout cart and all of the processes associated with it, and then the connectivity to the financial system, you'd never have e-commerce, right? And this is a dated 20-year-old example, but there is that innovation that not only is it kind of the operating trend of bringing physical goods online to sell them, but it's also this kind of payments and economic infrastructure to enable it. And of course, PayPal is very valuable. And so are other companies in the space continue to see innovation there. And there's an analogy here with the experience of people trying to use Web3 apps and, not having either the behavior or not having the tooling set up. And for Transak and companies like it to help the platforms and those developers, those builders to plug in what is similar to payment processing, but is, again, integrated into lots of different pieces and lots of different parts of the financial system. Can we talk about what those integrations look like? Like, if you look under the hood, into the gears, into all the parts of the engine, like, what exactly does Transak do? What does it plug into? What are the different things that you've had to build?
Sure. And before I do that, I just want to make a distinction that I really don't see Transak as a payments company, because the distinction here is that we plan to always remain as the merchant on record. So we would never be an acquirer or a payment processor for someone who wants to sell their own goods. It's not in the vision or appetite of the company, but we would sell crypto to an end user of that application. So when the end user buys the crypto, they would see that they're buying it from Transak. They would not see that they're buying it from Decentraland. So we're like the onboarding tool. Let's say, for example, Dapper Labs wanted to sell NFTs out of their own inventory and they wanted to handle the liquidity and they wanted to handle the compliance of selling those NFTs directly. We wouldn't then be the acquirer for them and process the payment. We would see that as something in the realm of a checkout or an Adyen or a WorldPay, right? So yeah, just wanted to make that quick distinction.
That's a key distinction. And I think it also goes to the earlier conversation we had about problem formulation and probably driving the highest leverage for the company too. That's not what you do in the world of what you do, talk to us about what does it mean to be merchant? What are you connected to and so on?
Yeah. So we use acquirers who will take the payment for us and send it to our bank account. We use solutions to do bank transfers. We use solutions for credit and debit cards, Apple Pay, Google Pay. And then we also handle the compliance ourselves. So that means getting the licenses in the relevant countries, such as an FCA license or FCA authorization in the UK. And then we also handle the risk operations ourselves. So that means that we take responsibility for fraud and chargebacks and KYC. We use vendors for all of those things, right? So we're not trying to be like a ID verification solution or like anything like that, but we coordinate a whole bunch of different vendors, and we've built in-house a risk engine that can take data from multiple vendors on the user's transaction and determine whether that should be honored or not, whether it's fraud or money laundering or something like that. On top of that, we also provide liquidity ourselves. So we source liquidity from over 10 different venues in order to get the best price for the user. We actually keep crypto exposure on our balance sheet, right? So it's kind of an intermediary exposure. We're not in the business of position taking, but we kind of act a bit like a market maker or a broker where we're kind of constantly sourcing the best price and selling to users. I guess the final piece of the puzzle is that we're also a developer integration, right? So we do all of those things and then we package it up into an easy, simple to onboard API, but an API that's also very powerful and configurable for those that want to do so.
A merchant's a store of stuff, right? So there are some merchants that sell sneakers, and the sneakers that you sell happen to be crypto assets, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And there's the first thing of like, well, what's your supply chain and where do you get the crypto assets? And the answer is you're working with a bunch of other financial intermediaries. You're basically sourcing at the best price to build an inventory of crypto assets to then go on and kind of sell downstream to consumers. And so it's interesting how that connects to the work you did early on in market making, high frequency trading. And so that's like the supply chain of crypto assets. And then the other dimension is you have to plug into how many different payment methods?
Right now, it's, I think, 7 payment methods in what we say is over 100 countries. But yeah, I mean, that list is expanding all the time as well.
Right. So you are selling these crypto asset sneakers and you have to accept payment for them. And so in the traditional economy, what are the different rails that you today integrate?
So it's faster payments in the UK, SEPA in Europe. Then there's the card networks, so Visa and MasterCard, Apple Pay and Google Pay. We have ACH coming soon, but we haven't shipped it yet. We did launch Indian payment methods a few months back, but we had to pull it back because the regulatory environment is kind of flip-flopping there every few months. But those are the ones so far.
Gotcha. Yeah, the world is indeed a beautiful mess as it relates to market crashes and regulatory oversight. But there's an additional sort of challenge just aside from the licensing bit, which is if you're setting up a regular merchant, Visa has probably very little emotions about it if you are a laundromat or actually selling sneakers or sandwiches. How did these different payment providers relate to you when you kind of flagged that you were a merchant of crypto assets? What were the challenges and kind of how did you get through them as it relates to these payments rails?
The answer to that has changed dramatically over time. So when I first started working on this problem, I think it took around a year to open our first bank account and first kind of payment rails. That was extremely challenging. And now the environment has changed dramatically. And most of the major acquirers are very open to this and make a lot of revenue from crypto-related payments. And then there's also an increasing number of banks that are either crypto-friendly or designed specifically for crypto coming up as well. But that's in kind of UK, Europe, and USA. I think other regions, the mileage will vary considerably.
Okay, and so there's been this sort of evolution and maturity, or maybe that's the wrong word. Maybe there's been more exploration by folks who want money in motion because they're actually starting to see money move in these ecosystems. And so it's a commercial opportunity. And then the last bit that I wanted to open up is like you are touching money. So what are the types of licensing that you bump up against, not necessarily get, but what are the regimes that you're kind of navigating between? In my mind, there is like this forest full of trees and monsters, and you kind of have to, weave between the shadows to not invoke one out of 200 different regulatory agencies who might misinterpret something that you're doing, depending on what billionaire owns Twitter. And so what's your decision-making approach to thinking through geography and thinking through regulation?
I see regulation as painful and difficult, but I also embrace it. And it's also part of our job is to take on regulation on behalf of the customers that we work with, because otherwise that's a big part of our value proposition. We take that on for the partners that we work with. And the licenses that we have right now is we have an FCA authorization. We're one of around 30 firms, I believe, who have that. That's called a virtual asset service provider or crypto asset service provider, which is different from a payments license, right? It's not like a payments institution or something like that. So that's a new license that was introduced in January 2021. It was introduced in January 2021. We're also an MSB, so a money service business in the US. And we're currently in the process of going state by state and getting the money transmitter license, which is, quite a big endeavor, as I'm sure a lot of people have heard. And then we're also kind of going strategically into new countries and getting licenses in a number of regions on top of that as well.
And how do you think about going broad versus going deep? Because you're covering a lot of geographies. What is the trade-off between, let's say just focusing on one geography and trying to get a ton of penetration there, trying to accelerate as much regulatory leeway as possible, versus really building out this horizontal map across the world?
It's two very, very different problems. So there are some apps where, in order to work with them, you kind of need to have this table stakes of like UK, Europe, USA. Some apps just, have so much of their users based in USA. And we quite like to work with partners where we're the exclusive provider for them. So we don't want them to have to be kind of patching together multiple solutions in order to hit multiple regions. And sometimes if you don't have those regions, then, it just won't work for them. And then there are more regional plays, right? You might work with specifically a finance application for people in the UK or for people in India. In that case, it doesn't matter about your total coverage. It only matters how good your coverage is in that specific country. And so I think we've done a pretty good job in getting what I would call the table stakes regions online now. And so I'm quite interested in just going country by country or region by region and just getting a really, really perfect solution for that region and not trying to go too broad too fast. I want to do a really, really good job in the regions where we're in. I don't want to compromise on quality for the sake of being broad coverage at all, because it's not just about the payment rails. You also have to do a lot of stuff on onboarding, right? And it's not just about getting the license either. You have to actually do the risk operations in that country. KYC is different. Transaction monitoring is different. And then you actually have to do the sales and marketing in that region. It's not just build it and they will come. You actually have to go and build a regional sales team and speak to apps and understand the flavors of how people do things in those regions, right? So India is very, very different to UK, for example. So I would say now that we've gotten a sufficient table stakes, we want to focus on going deep rather than too broad.
How do you think about your scope and your expansion? If we fast forward to Transak getting done everything possible on its roadmap, what does the company look like?
We would be in a lot of countries with local payment methods, both processing cards through a local entity and using whatever local payment methods there are. So, for example, UPI in India or faster payments in the UK, in the majority of regions that are not, sanctioned or out of limits for some reason. On top of that, Transak would be a very complete onboarding stack for apps. It would either solve or work very smoothly with solutions that solve each stage of the onboarding journey. And, we don't necessarily need to build out, for example, all of the different wallet solutions ourselves, but I want to kind of collaborate and work very smoothly with all the different types of wallets out there. Same thing with identity, same thing with meta transactions, same thing with onboarding analytics. And then I also want to make a developer experience that's very self-serve, very, very, very easy to kind of just pick up and use without needing too much help from any human person, but also a developer experience that's very, very powerful and allows the user to build an app that's very, very flexible and I want Transak to look kind of invisible in that role, right? So the app would have all of these onboarding aspects built into it, but at the end, they would just click a button for like Apple Pay or to make a bank transfer, and it, you wouldn't really know that it's Transak there. It would just be like the app would be having the relationship with the user, and we're just empowering the app to build the best possible experience.
One more question on this topic, I think, around the idea of onboarding. How should we think about the opportunity of onboarding, right? Because you said you don't want to do the ongoing payment processing within some particular application. And I certainly believe that there's a secular shift between, Web 2 and Web 3, and that there's a giant delta of value to go from traditional banks into finance on decentralized or computational rails more broadly. That's like capturing a delta, right? That's capturing a transition. When you think about the system as a whole, is that delta permanent? Like it will always have some amount of energy from traditional finance moving into crypto finance? Or is there a point where like everything's normalized and even just the idea of on-ramp won't make sense anymore because we will all have been on-ramped? Another question about problem definition or scope definition there.
Yeah, so this is the extremely futuristic, but also extremely valid question of, what if we do our job so well that we onboard everyone and we become redundant, right? In this case, I would say that I see Web 2 applications and Web 3 applications converging in the future. And I don't think that people will call them Web 3 applications anymore. They'll just call them apps in the same way that people don't call like Facebook a Web 2 application. They just call it an app. And I think that a lot of these concepts will become normalized and that we will reach some kind of equilibrium point between the two. And I think that tools like Transak will help apps to find that equilibrium point. And we intend to work both with, for example, DeFi and TradFi. Our aim for the DeFi apps is to make them look more like the TradFi apps. And our aim for the TradFi apps is to make them look more like the DeFi apps. So that our mission kind of collapses these categories into one as well, which I'm totally okay with. And I think that we as a company just have to be very, very sensitive on what the world is ready for at each stage and not try to give people something that they're not ready for, not try to be too futuristic, but at the same time also not be behind and try to adopt what people are ready for at the right time. Ultimately, I want Transak to be the onboarding stack for modern applications, right? Help apps that involve money and require users to have a balance of money, help them to onboard their users. That's the main aim. I'm pretty agnostic of, Web 2, Web 3. It's just that I see Web 3 being the future.
That's a fantastic place for us to pause. If our audience wants to learn more about you or more about Transak and what it can do for them, where should they go?
They can go to transak.com, transak.com, and you can either sign up to be a partner if you're a developer, so you can integrate Transak, or if you want to buy crypto, you can buy crypto, or if you want to work with us, you can go to careers.transak.com. We work remotely across the whole world, but mostly in USA, UK, and India.
So fantastic to have you in the conversation today. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me. This was fun. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the Fintech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.